If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to the channel. Sharing it with your friends and family helps spread knowledge. And when we help others grow, we grow too. Thank you so much for listening. Let's dive into the podcast. The fire on Christmas Eve. 5 children missing. The clock had just passed midnight when Mary and Sodder woke to the smell of smoke. Christmas Day, 1945, was supposed to bring joy to their home in Fayetteville, West Virginia. Instead, it brought terror. Flames were already climbing the walls when George Sodder realized their house was on fire. The family rushed into action. George and Marion grabbed their youngest children from downstairs rooms. 4 children made it out safely into the cold December night, but 5 children slept upstairs. Maurice, 14, Martha, 12, Louis, 9, Jenny, 8, Betty, just 5 years old. The wooden stairs had become a wall of fire. No one could reach them. George ran outside, desperate to find a ladder. The family truck wouldn't start. The phone line was dead. Neighbors heard the screaming and came running, but it was too late. The old house burned like paper in the winter wind. Within 45 minutes, everything was gone. Only charred beams and ash remained where the Sodder home once stood. The fire had moved so fast that nothing could be saved. When the sun rose on Christmas morning, a strange discovery waited in the ruins, or rather, a strange absence. Fire investigators began sifting through the debris. They expected to find bones, teeth, anything left of 5 young bodies. House fires burn hot, but they don't make people disappear completely. There should have been something. They found nothing. No bones, no teeth, no buttons from clothes, no metal from shoes. The fire had been fierce, yes, but not fierce enough to turn 5 children into nothing but air. The local fire chief scratched his head. In all his years fighting fires, he had never seen anything like this. Bodies leave traces, even in the worst blazes. Metal bed springs from upstairs remained twisted but recognizable. How could children vanish so completely when metal survived? George Sodder stood in the ashes of his home, holding his surviving children close. Something felt wrong beyond the tragedy of loss. The pieces didn't fit together. The truck that wouldn't start had worked fine the day before. The phone that went dead had been working perfectly. And those 5 missing children, where were they? In his heart, George began to wonder if they had died in the fire at all. Maybe, just maybe, they were somewhere else entirely. Somewhere they shouldn't be. The questions began that Christmas morning. They would haunt the Sodder family for decades to come. Early investigations and unusual circumstances. When morning came, the official investigation began. The fire chief arrived with his team to examine what remained of the Sodder home. They poked through the ashes and studied the burned walls. After a few hours, they reached their conclusion. Faulty electrical wiring, the fire chief announced. He pointed to some charred cables near the kitchen. The report would be filed away. Case closed. But George and Jenny Sodder could not accept this simple answer. Something felt wrong about the entire investigation. They watched the officials work and noticed things that troubled them deeply. The fire department had taken almost 7 hours to arrive at their burning home. 7 hours. George had called for help repeatedly, but no trucks came. When the firefighters finally appeared, they claimed their equipment had frozen. Yet other families in town received help that same night without any problems. George walked through the ruins himself. He knew his house well. He had wired parts of it with his own hands. The electrical system worked fine just days before the fire. Nothing had sparked or flickered. No fuses had blown. The investigators seemed rushed. They spent little time examining the debris. They asked few questions about the missing children. When George pointed out strange details, they brushed him off. Their minds were already made up. Jenny discovered something even more disturbing. She found the family's Christmas decorations in the ashes. The tree ornaments lay scattered but recognizable. Some furniture pieces remained partially intact. Yet 5 children had supposedly burned completely without leaving any trace. The Sodders had buried their dead before. They knew what fire did to human remains. Bones do not simply vanish. Teeth survive intense heat. Metal from belt buckles and shoe eyelets should remain. The investigators found nothing. Not one fragment of 5 young lives. George questioned the coroner about this impossible situation. The man grew uncomfortable and changed the subject. No proper examination of the debris ever took place. No sifting for remains. No search for evidence of the children. Local authorities wanted the case forgotten quickly. They pressured the family to accept the official story and move on. But parents cannot simply move on when their children disappear. The Sodders began asking harder questions. Why had their phone lines been cut before the fire started? Who was the stranger asking for directions just days before? What about the missing ladder that could have reached the second-floor windows? Each question led to another mystery. The official investigation had ignored these crucial details. The Sodders realized they would have to search for answers themselves. The truth lay buried somewhere beneath the official story. That night brought more than just fire. Strange things had been happening for days. But on December 24th, 1945, everything went wrong at once. The fire started around midnight. George Sodder tried to call for help. He picked up the phone. Nothing. The line was dead. He ran outside to check. Someone had cut the telephone wires clean through. This was no accident. George rushed to his truck. He needed to drive for help. The engine would not start. It had worked fine just hours before. Now it sat silent in the cold night air. His other truck also refused to start. Both vehicles dead on the same night as the fire. The family screamed for help. Neighbors heard their cries. But the fire department took hours to arrive. The Sodders lived just 2 miles from town. The volunteer firefighters later claimed they never got the call. How could that be when neighbors had telephoned immediately? When the fire trucks finally came, they brought no water. The firefighters claimed the water had frozen in the trucks. But other fires that winter had been fought without such problems. They used bucket chains and well water instead. The house burned completely to the ground. Days before the fire, strange visitors had come to the house. A man stopped asking for directions he clearly did not need. He stared too long at the children playing outside. He made comments about the family that made George uncomfortable. The man seemed to know too much about them. Another stranger had appeared selling life insurance. When George refused to buy, the man grew angry. He pointed at the house and said it would burn someday. He warned that George's children would pay for his stubbornness. The threat felt real and cold. On the night before Christmas Eve, the older children stayed up late. They heard strange sounds outside. Footsteps crunched in the snow around the house. When they looked out, they saw shadows moving between the trees. Someone was watching them. The ladder that usually leaned against the house had vanished. George kept it there for emergencies. That night, when he needed to reach the second-floor windows where his children slept, the ladder was gone. Later, they found it thrown in a ditch far from the house. These events painted a darker picture than any electrical fire. Someone had planned this carefully. They had cut the phones, disabled the trucks, stolen the ladder, threatened the family. Then they had watched the house burn. The question remained burning in everyone's mind. What had they really wanted? A family's quest leads, sightings, and false hope. Hope is a fragile thing, especially when it arrives in the form of a stranger's voice on the telephone. For the Sodder family, that voice came just weeks after the fire, bringing news that would both lift their hearts and torment their souls for decades to come. A woman called from Charleston, her voice shaking with excitement. She had seen them, she insisted. 4 children at a small motel just off Route 21. The oldest boy looked exactly like Maurice. The girl could be Martha. They were with a man and woman who kept them close, never letting them wander far from sight. George and Jenny Sodder dropped everything and drove through the night. Their hands trembled as they knocked on motel room doors, asking questions that must have sounded strange to other guests. But the children were gone. The desk clerk remembered the family, but could offer no useful details. The trail had gone cold before it even began. This became a pattern that would haunt the Sodders for years. Phone calls would arrive at odd hours. Letters would appear in their mailbox with no return address. A truck driver claimed he saw Betty at a diner in Florida. A teacher in Ohio was certain she recognized Louis in her classroom. Each report sent the family racing across state lines, chasing shadows of their lost children. The most convincing sighting came from a woman in Florida who approached Jenny at a department store. She pulled Jenny aside and whispered urgently about a group of children she had seen at a hotel months earlier. The woman described them perfectly, down to Martha's curly hair and Louis's shy smile. She had watched them for days, she said, because something felt wrong about their situation. But when the Sodders arrived in Florida, that hotel had no records. The staff had changed completely. Once again, they found themselves staring at empty rooms and unanswered questions. Some reports came with strange details that made them harder to dismiss. A man in Texas claimed he had given the children food when they appeared hungry and lost. He remembered Louis asking about West Virginia in a voice thick with homesickness. A store owner in California swore Martha had tried to buy candy with coins that bore dates from before the fire. Each sighting carved deeper wounds into the family's hearts. They wanted desperately to believe, yet doubt crept in with every dead end. Were these kind strangers genuinely trying to help, or were they simply seeing what the Sodders needed them to see? The reports continued for nearly 2 decades, each one carrying the weight of possibility and the sting of disappointment. The Sodders followed every lead, no matter how far it took them from home. Winter mornings brought more than cold air to the Sodder mailbox. Strange letters arrived without return addresses. Phone calls came at odd hours with whispered voices claiming to know something about the missing children. In 1952, a woman approached Jenny Sodder at the local market. Her hands shook as she spoke in hushed tones. She had been traveling through Florida when she stopped at a small roadside motel. There, she claimed, she saw 5 children who looked exactly like the Sodder family photographs that had appeared in newspapers. The woman described how the children seemed scared and wouldn't speak to anyone. An older man watched them closely, never letting them out of his sight. When she tried to approach the youngest girl, the man quickly ushered all the children into a waiting car. The license plate was too dirty to read clearly. George and Jenny packed their bags that same week. They drove south for days, stopping at every motel and diner along the route the woman had described. They showed photographs to desk clerks and waitresses. Some nodded with recognition, others just shook their heads sadly. But the most shocking discovery came 20 years after the fire. An envelope arrived with no postmark, no stamp. Inside was a single photograph that made Jenny's heart stop beating for several seconds. The black and white image showed a young man who looked strikingly like Louis would have looked as an adult. The same dark eyes, the same shape of jaw that ran in the Sodder family. On the back, someone had scrawled in block letters, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, ill boys, A90132 or 35. The message made no sense, but the face was unmistakable. Jenny carried that photograph everywhere. She showed it to police officers, private detectives, and anyone who would listen. Some believed it was Louis. Others suggested it might be a cruel hoax designed to torture the grieving family. The photograph sparked new investigations. Reporters wrote fresh stories about the case. Amateur detectives offered their theories about what the strange numbers might mean. Was it a code? An address? A prisoner identification number? Each lead felt like lighting a candle in a dark room. For a brief moment, hope would flicker bright and warm. Then reality would creep back in, and the darkness would return. But the Sodders never stopped believing that somewhere, somehow, their children might still be alive and waiting to come home. The mysterious clues kept coming, each one stranger than the last. George Sodder packed his worn suitcase one more time. Jenny handed him sandwiches wrapped in brown paper. Their eyes met across the kitchen table, and no words were needed. They had done this dance dozens of times before. The morning sun cast long shadows as George climbed into his old Ford. Jenny watched from the window as he drove away, heading toward another distant town where someone claimed to have seen their children. This time, it was Ohio. Last month, it had been Kentucky. Before that, West Virginia. George carried a small notebook filled with addresses, police stations, sheriff's offices, missing persons departments. He had memorized the faces of every clerk and detective from here to California. Some still listened when he walked through their doors. Others just shook their heads and looked away. In Charleston, a woman at the bus station swore she had seen 5 children who looked just like the Sodder kids. George drove 8 hours through mountain roads to meet her. She pointed to an empty bench and said they had been sitting right there, waiting for someone to pick them up. But when George showed her the photographs, her certainty faded. Maybe they were younger, maybe older, maybe not them at all. Jenny stayed home and answered the telephone. Strangers called at all hours with tips and theories. A man in Florida said he worked with a boy named Maurice who talked about a house fire in West Virginia. A woman in Texas claimed her neighbor had adopted 5 children from back east. Each call set Jenny's heart racing. Each call ended in silence. The family spent their life savings chasing shadows. George sold his trucking equipment to pay for gas money and hotel rooms. Jenny took extra work washing clothes for neighbors. Their surviving children watched their parents grow thinner and more desperate with each passing month. Local newspapers wrote stories about their search. Radio stations broadcast their plea for information. The photographs of Betty, Jenny, Martha, Louis, and Maurice appeared in papers across 12 states. Tips poured in from everywhere and nowhere. George kept a map on his kitchen wall, covered in red pins. Each pin marked a place where someone thought they had seen his children. The pins stretched from Maine to California, creating a web of false hope and broken dreams. Still they searched. Still they believed. Still they packed sandwiches and drove endless miles down empty highways, following whispers and rumors that led to locked doors and empty rooms. Public appeals and enduring uncertainty. The Sodder family refused to let the world forget their missing children. In the months after the fire, they made a choice that would define the rest of their lives. They would not stay quiet. They would not give up. They would make sure everyone knew their children's faces. George Sodder spent what money he had on something unusual for 1946. He bought space on a giant billboard along Route 16, where thousands of people drove every day. The sign was simple but powerful. 5 young faces stared out at passing cars. Below their photos, bold letters spelled out a question that haunted the family. What happened to these children? The billboard became a local landmark. People would slow down to read it. Some stopped their cars to study the faces more carefully. For 23 years, that sign stood tall. Rain and snow weathered the wood, but the message stayed clear. The Sodder children were still missing. But George and Jenny wanted more than just attention. They offered money for answers. The reward started small, then grew larger as years passed. By the 1960s, they promised $10,000 for information about their children. That was serious money back then. Enough to buy a nice house. The reward brought strange visitors to their door. Some people seemed honest, but had nothing useful to share. Others told wild stories that made no sense. A few clearly just wanted the money and made up tales that fell apart under questioning. Each false lead felt like a fresh wound. Letters arrived from all over the country. Most meant well, but offered little help. Some writers claimed they had seen the children in distant cities. Others shared dreams or visions that felt important to them, but led nowhere real. The family read every letter, followed every hint that seemed possible. The Sodders learned that public appeals had limits. The billboard drew attention, but not always the right kind. The reward money attracted people, but many had nothing genuine to offer. Years turned into decades, and the answers they desperately wanted remained just out of reach. Still, they never stopped trying. The billboard became more than advertising. It was proof that these children had lived and been loved. It was a promise that their family would never stop searching. Even when hope grew thin, that weathered sign along the highway kept asking its silent question to anyone willing to listen. Some mysteries resist solving, no matter how loud you shout or how much money you offer. The Sodder case was becoming one of those stubborn puzzles that time could not fix. The story of the missing Sodder children spread slowly at first. Local newspapers picked it up when the billboard first appeared. Then radio stations began talking about it. The mysterious case caught people's attention in ways no one expected. By the 1960s, television reporters started visiting the family home. They interviewed George and Jenny, now older but still determined. Camera crews filmed the billboard and the empty lot where the house once stood. Each news story brought fresh tips from strangers across the country. A private detective from Florida claimed he had spotted one of the boys working in construction. The family paid for his investigation. He came back with photographs and promises. But when they looked closer, nothing matched. The hope turned to disappointment once again. Writers became fascinated by the case. True crime magazines featured the story with dramatic headlines and artist drawings of the missing children. Each article brought more letters to the Sodder mailbox. Some contained wild theories. Others offered sympathy. A few claimed to know exactly what happened that night. The National Guard said they would help search the woods one more time. Volunteers joined them with metal detectors and shovels. They combed through acres of forest near the house. They found old bottles, rusted metal, and animal bones, but no trace of the children ever surfaced. Television producers wanted to make a movie about the mystery. The family declined. They said their pain was not entertainment. They wanted answers, not fame. The story belonged to their children, not to Hollywood. In the 1970s, a new generation of reporters discovered the case. They interviewed neighbors who remembered that December night. Some details had changed over time. Stories grew larger or smaller depending on who told them. The truth became harder to separate from memory and rumor. Private citizens formed their own investigation groups. They studied police reports and interviewed witnesses the authorities had missed. These amateur detectives spent their own money traveling to West Virginia. They knocked on doors and asked questions. Their dedication was real, but their findings led nowhere new. The case appeared in books about unsolved mysteries. Each author presented the known facts differently. Some suspected kidnapping. Others believed the fire was deliberately set. A few thought the children had died in the blaze, despite the missing bones. George Sodder died in 1969, taking his certainties to the grave. Jenny continued the search alone. She kept the billboard maintained and answered every letter that arrived. She never stopped believing her children were somewhere out there, grown up and wondering about their family. The mystery had become larger than the tragedy itself. People who never knew the Sodders felt connected to their loss. The case represented every parent's worst fear and every family's deepest hope. By 1989, Jenny Sodder had carried the weight of not knowing for 44 years. She was 89 years old when she finally took down the billboard. The faces of her 5 children had watched over the highway for decades, asking the same silent question: where are we? The billboard came down. But the questions remained. Jenny died in 1989, followed by her surviving children one by one. Each death took away another piece of first-hand memory, another voice that might have held a crucial detail. The family's personal search ended, but something strange happened. The mystery refused to die with them. New investigators appeared every few years. Some were professional detectives. Others were amateur researchers drawn to the puzzle. They all found the same maddening gaps. The missing bones that should have been there. The phone calls that came before the fire. The strange man asking about the Sodder children weeks earlier. The cut phone line. The missing ladder. Each clue pointed somewhere, but nowhere definite. Like breadcrumbs in a dark forest, the evidence led investigators in circles. Some became obsessed, spending years trying to solve what the police had given up on decades ago. They interviewed elderly neighbors who remembered that night. They studied old photographs with magnifying glasses. They compared witness statements line by line. The internet age brought new attention to the case. Online forums buzzed with theories. Amateur detectives shared photographs and documents. Someone always had a new angle, a fresh perspective, a connection nobody had seen before. The story spread further than any billboard ever could. But distance and time had washed away the strongest leads. People who might have held answers were gone. Records had been lost or destroyed. Memory had faded and changed. What remained was a collection of haunting details that fit together like pieces from different puzzles. The Sodder house lot stood empty for years, grass growing where the family had once lived. Visitors still came. They walked the ground where the fire had burned, looking for something the investigators had missed. Some claimed to feel a presence there, as if the children were still waiting to be found. Today, more than 75 years later, the case file remains open in the minds of those who know the story. 5 children walked into their bedrooms on Christmas Eve, 1945. By morning, they had vanished from the world. No graves mark their passing. No death certificates record their end. They exist in a space between missing and found, between memory and mystery. The questions that kept George and Jenny Sodder awake for decades continue to whisper in the darkness. What really happened that night? Are the children buried somewhere in unmarked graves? Did they grow old in different families, with different names, never knowing their true identity? The mystery has become eternal, passed down like a ghost story that refuses to rest.